So our next segment, we're going to be talking about our campaign's relationship to solidarity with Palestine and our policy related to Israel-Palestine specifically, which, on first blush, some folks may not think of Maryland having a relationship with Israel or having anything to say about the struggle for Palestinian liberation. But in fact, Democrats and Republicans in Maryland have made sure that it is a state level issue. And I think, I mentioned debate before, and we know debate is a big part of your biography, Andy. I was thinking about, when I first got involved with Palestinian solidarity work, and I was thinking about, okay, maybe the first time I was at a protest outside of the Israeli embassy in DC, that must have been 2013. And, working to found and convene Baltimore Palestine Solidarity in Baltimore in 2014, some of that work. But it actually started before then. I took a class taught by a Palestinian who was the ambassador from the Palestinian Authority to the UK, and a Jewish professor who had been born in Argentina and moved to Israel, Palestine. And in that class, they organized a debate, and it was really and I decided to take the side of the Palestinians in the debate, and along with kind of learning about the history of the Middle East and that region in particular, and some of my other coursework at UMD, taking the opposite side of what had been my stance for the most part up until then, growing up Jewish. That kind of is what started to lead to the paradigm shift for me. I mean, it wasn't like 2007. I took that class in 2008. I was out protesting. It took a little bit longer than that, but I really want to emphasize the importance of debate and healthy debate and well-organized debate from multiple perspectives in allowing folks to make up their own minds about these really polemical and difficult issues. And that's where I kind of start my movement towards Palestinian solidarity in that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I think it's really important to remind folks of the importance of that. And I think one of the points that we were making with Taylor, and you'll hear us make throughout the campaign, is that one of our core campaign goals is to get on the debate stage. And the reason we want to get on the debate stage is because having different perspectives, other than the things the two parties agree on, having different perspectives on that stage changes the outcome, it changes the discussion, it changes the debate. And I think your story about that is a really illustrative one about how we get there. I had up on the screen our new Israel page just dropped today on the priorities page of our website. I'll go ahead and put the link in the chat here. But you made the case, you were making the case there that Maryland is complicit in genocide. Obviously, we detail some of that here, but there's no way that anybody can read what's on this page on their screen unless they've got the biggest of TVs. So can you talk to us about some of the ways that Maryland is currently complicit with genocide?
Yeah, sure. So let's get into that policy. I think earlier we talked about a Break the Bonds campaign that's being led by Jewish Voice for Peace, specifically the DC Metro and Baltimore chapters, as well as other coalition members. And we featured an article by Jessel Noor in Truth Out. And I think, again, we're talking about the importance of debate, but we're also with Taylor and other folks talking about the value of long haul organizing. And as I was reading that article, there was a sentence which, would have seemed right at home in some of the sections of our webpage on this that you can read later that said, Maryland has a long and close relationship. The state of Maryland has a long and close relationship with the state of Israel. And the hyperlink, I'm a dork, I follow those hyperlinks, and it went to a bill from a member of the General Assembly from about 2017 that was against BDS, that would forbid any company from doing business with the state of Maryland if it participated in some way in the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I think, first of all, it's kind of ludicrous on its face that the state should be policing the politics of its vendors and contractors in that way. But more importantly, I contacted the journalist and I said, hey, it's true that Maryland does have that position, but it's not because the General Assembly, the People's House at the state level, passed a bill through the legislature saying that should be the law of the land. Actually, multiple years in a row, coalitions that I was a member of, Freedom to Boycott Maryland was one, defeated that bill over and over again in the General Assembly. They could not muster the support of a majority of members of the General Assembly to pass that bill. And so former Governor Hogan actually enacted it as an executive order. And in fact, Governor Moore, when he was running for office, in at least one, I think it was a J. Moore magazine interview, he pledged to steadfastly stand by that executive order of his Republican predecessor to police the politics of vendors and contractors when it came to supporting the Palestinian movement's right to live, as the first graphic that you showed said. And so we have this kind of bipartisan consensus, not down the road in Washington, D.C., when it comes to favoring Israel and favoring the value of Israeli lives over the value of Palestinian lives. It's right here in Annapolis. It's right at the governor's level. And it's so unpopular that they can't pass it through the General Assembly. So one of our policies that we're rolling out as it relates to the relationship between Maryland and the Palestinian Solidarity is that we would, if elected, cancel that executive order and say that, contractors are in Maryland are, Maryland is open for business when it comes to contractors who participate in BDS, right?
Right. And I mean, people will often ask, what is the first thing you're going to do? And my answer to that is usually like, realize, oh no, we're in charge now. But I think after that, I often say, like, we're going to sit down and have dinner with our friends and family. But the next thing we're going to do is repeal this executive order. It is a ridiculous piece of law. It is there. It is almost entirely symbolic. And it does not actually really stop anybody, as far as I can tell. It is just there as a virtue signal from the governance or from the state of Maryland in order to say that we want to align ourselves with Israel. So that's day one. We're repealing that. That's symbolic. Let's talk about some of the other things on here that are not about boycott, but are about divestment, and talk about the way that we can begin to get Maryland's money out of supporting Israel.
Yeah, let's get into it. So I do want to put a caveat, though. I agree it is symbolic, but the reason why civil liberties groups like the ACLU of Maryland and others who are constitutional rights groups, for that matter, opposed this anti-BDS executive order by former Governor Hogan and current Governor Wes Moore is not because of the symbolism of it, but because it chilled speech. Right now, every business owner who might ever want to contract with Maryland has to watch what they say about supporting a boycott, even in a symbolic way, of the state of Israel to end the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians. So there is a chilling effect, which moves a little bit beyond the symbolic into freedom of speech issues, which I think are really important.
I mean, I would not be surprised if the moment that we go to file our public financing claim that says that the government of Maryland owes us $800,000 because we have gotten enough people to support our campaign to be engaged in public financing, I would not be surprised if somebody tries to invoke this executive order as a means of trying to stop us from getting that money, because we're very clear that we should be able to boycott boycott Israel, and especially boycott the illegal settlements and the West Bank. And I would not be surprised if there's somebody out there looking to try to figure out a way to say that that executive order applies to our public financing. When it happens, we can play this clip back and say that we predicted it. But let's move on to the next one, the dissolving the Maryland Israel Development Center. This one has gotten a lot of attention with a lot of activist groups in the state. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this policy piece would do?
Yeah. So you mentioned that one of the folks that people associate with the Green Party, Ralph Nader, was quite adept at finding these relatively obscure bodies within government and using them as points of leverage. And so the MIDC, the Maryland Israeli Development Center, has a relatively small budget. It's a public-private partnership that seeks to promote business ties between Maryland, the free state, and the apartheid state of Israel. And so it's sort of kind of a business incubator, but it gets public dollars from the state of Maryland. And it really doesn't need to exist. Maryland shouldn't be prioritizing the growth of companies that benefit and CEOs and that benefit from apartheid in historic Palestine. That doesn't need to be part of our economy and our growth plans here in the state of Maryland.
Right. And one of the things that's most interesting to me about this is exactly that point. It is not like, but for the Maryland Israel Development Center, these businesses wouldn't exist. These businesses exist. They're capitalized. Oftentimes they're in security and defense sectors or cybersecurity sectors and things like that. And it is really Maryland not doing this because the businesses need it. It is Maryland doing it because it wants to virtue signal that it is a friend of Israel and that it is choosing sides in this conflict. You mentioned Ralph Nader, and I was looking at some Ralph Nader speeches from back in 2000. And in October of 2000, he was at a press conference and they were asking him all sorts of questions about whether he was going to spoil the election and why he was doing this. But somebody said something to him that was a question that was basically like, what do you think about the ongoing conflict in Israel and Palestine? And at that point in 2000, there had been a flare up of the kind of conflict that we've seen for years and years. And he said, look, you can't be an honest broker for peace if you're only friends with one side. And if Americans are only going to be friends with Israelis, then they should not say that they're trying to negotiate a peace here. They should say they're an ally and they're responsible for whatever Israel does. And I thought that statement by Ralph Nader at the time in 2000, we're not talking 2016, 2020, 2024, we're talking 25 years ago, Ralph Nader was making this an issue in that election. And I think it's one of the things that Greens have almost always broken with the two parties on. Reparations is one, education is one, Israel is one, and criminal justice is one. And I think it was helpful for me to go back and understand that this is not a thing that happened for the Green Party recently. This is the thing that has been happening for the Green Party for a long time. And I think getting rid of the Maryland Israel Development Center feels like an easy ask. It's not helping Maryland that much. It's not costing Maryland that much. But the political weight of taking a stance that says, I'm not here to be a friend of Israel, is heavy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So let's move on to the next one. This is one that if you're just joining us, we discussed kind of at the top of the show in our commentary on the news. And so there's over $70 million of Maryland public sector workers' retirement pensions or retirement funds that the workers are required to contribute to in some cases, and don't have a say over where those funds are invested. There's a board that oversees this. One of the members of the board is the treasurer appointed by the General Assembly, so accountable to your member of the General Assembly on some level. Other members represent the governor's interests, the comptrollers there, and then the two institutional unions also have some members on this board, and they've invested tens of millions of dollars of the Maryland pension fund in Israel bonds, which are low yield and, much more importantly, are totally unethical and have been used to supply the Israeli Defense Forces, the armed forces of Israel, which has been, carpet bombing Gaza and killing tens of thousands of Gazan people of late. But not just recently. We know that this ethnic cleansing goes back decades, and so divesting Maryland's pensions from genocide in Israel and elsewhere would be a top priority of an Ellis, Silverman Andrews administration.
Absolutely. You don't need to say much more about that. It's a simple ask. We're going to move on it. Let's talk about the next one, the Port of Baltimore and the facilitations of weapon shipments.
Yeah, so ports are really important. Baltimore has one of the busiest ports on the East Coast, and there's a lot of goods that come through that port. And I think one of the interesting things that you can kind of speak to, Andy, as we were researching this, there is, and this is the thread again between the policy positions of left third party campaigns and grassroots movements for justice. So there is an ongoing block the boat campaign. It's not new. It's been years in the making. It's part of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is to block goods coming from Israel or owned by Israeli cargo companies. And that is it's a grassroots campaign. It's a civil disobedience campaign. But what is the role of an electoral campaign, especially at the state level, in calling for it? I mean, what can a governor do as it relates to the Port of Baltimore?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting question, because the first instinct is going to say, when I am governor, we're going to ban weapons shipments out of the Port of Baltimore. Well, we can do that, and we're going to find ourselves in court before the ink is dry on it, because federal law regulates weapons with the decision about this, and exactly in order to stop some yahoo like me from getting in the governor's office and shutting down weapons transferred to Israel. Like, this is part of the reason that there is a law in place around this, is because this has been a pressure point. And so they the feds have taken this away from the states, so that the states cannot say, you will not ship weapons through our ports. Now, what the states can do is be a pain in the ass. They can not provide state services. They can protect workers who might strike. They can speak out against it. They can slow roll things. They can deprioritize things. There's a lot of levers of administrative power that one branch of government can use, or one level of government can use, in order to make it hard for the other level of governments to do the things that they want to do. So if we are elected, we are going to make sure that the Port of Baltimore is as hard as possible for any of the companies and any of the boats that want to ship weapons or secondary things like construction equipment and things like that to Israel. As long as Israel is maintaining an illegal apartheid, an illegal occupation, engaging in genocide and engaging in war crimes, the Port of Baltimore is going to be as difficult as it can be in order to be a place to ship weapons through, because that is not what we should be doing there. And I think a lot of that means supporting workers who might decide that they want to strike and not unload the boat, protecting them from retaliation, and making sure that we're putting whatever forces we can behind any workers or anybody else who decides that they don't want to do it. We can't directly stop the shipments. We'll find ourselves in jail and the shipments will start again if we were elected and we tried to do that. But we can raise this issue. We can raise it on the debate stage. We can raise it on live streams like this, and we can demand that Governor Moore and whatever generic Republican they choose to be able to, take a position on this, because our port is our asset. It is a public asset. It is a piece of infrastructure, and we can and should do whatever we can to make sure it's not a logistical hub for genocide.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And I just want to pull on that thread a little bit as it relates to worker solidarity and organized labor. And, public sector labor law is determined at the state level, private sector labor law historically since the New Deal has been determined at the federal level, but there's a question mark hanging over the rights of workers to organize and the rights of new unions to be recognized because of Trump. I mean, Trump is an existential threat. President Trump is an existential threat to organized labor. And there are steps that states around the country, including New York, are starting to take to say, if the Trump administration does away with the ability of unions to be recognized at the federal level, then that's going to trigger at the state level the creation of a board to kind of mimic that federal level oversight and recognition. And so that's something that could happen. And there's a through line between the workers' rights and Palestinian solidarity and this block the boat, ambition, even if the governor doesn't have the power to regulate that interstate or international transit. We can certainly support movements who are doing that work. We can support workers who are doing that work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of that, let's close this out on these last two things that talk about the workers and the students at our campuses and how that is involved with Israeli universities on the one hand and the protection of dissent on the other.
Yeah, I think Taylor was kind of talking about earlier her path towards radicalization or kind of moving outside of the traditional parties. And I think another part of that awakening for me was, I grew up thinking that education and schools are inherently good. And I realized that, schooling and which includes universities, are part of the power structure that maintain an oppressive status quo. And we see that in cities. And, Andy, you've had Devarian Baldwin on the show to talk about what that looks like in cities. But I think also the connections between Maryland universities and colleges, the military complex, and Israel are real and exist, and especially as it relates to public universities where the governor has oversight and appoints members of the boards of trustees or the regents. That's something that we need to end, and I think that's something within the purview to end. On the flip side of that, defending the free speech of students who want to protest on campus is really, really important. We've seen a violent crackdown on protests, including at, I'm in a doc program at University of Virginia. Students there were tear gassed, and the state really cracked down. Maryland, we didn't see quite as violent a crackdown as in some other places, but the governor and the presidents of these universities and the boards were sending really hostile messages. And I think that would change if there was a governor and a lieutenant governor who, stood by students' right to protest, stood by students' right to free speech. And where that free speech is most endangered now is speaking up in solidarity with Palestine.
Yep, totally. And so thank you, Owen. I really appreciate this. This deep dive into the Israel-Palestine policy that we would enact as the governor is really interesting. A lot of times people will say, well, what does the governor of Maryland have to do with Israel? Or what does the governor of Maryland have to do with Palestine? And I actually think that's the right question. I think the right question is, what is it that a governor has to do with this basically foreign policy question? But because Maryland has decided to align itself with Israel, not because it needs to, but because it wants to, in order to signal its which side it has chosen in this conflict, there is a lot of opportunity for the government in Maryland to disentangle us from Israel, from supporting Israeli genocide, from supporting Israeli apartheid and occupation, and to move us toward a respect for international law and a respect for human rights. So this is going to be a thing that we're talking about a lot in the campaign. I encourage everybody to go to the website, gogreen26.com Israel. Each of these sections that we talked about here, you can expand and see more detail, and we'll be adding pieces to this over time to document the history and the things that Owen and I were talking about at various points of this. But we really wanted to take this question on from a Maryland specific perspective and answer it with as much detail as we could in a way that actually helped people in Maryland understand the way that our government, our tax dollars, and our elected leaders are complicit with genocide, and the way that we can move to stop that.